Well, it's 9 o'clock, and I want to say welcome and good morning to this morning brief. My name is Mette Amdi. I am a program manager here at CBS Executive Fund. And today I'm very, very happy that we are together for the next 45 minutes for hopefully a fantastic dialogue and insight into the theme around sustainability and how to develop the right mix of competencies within sustainability. Because despite the current backlash against sustainability in some areas, the discussion of competencies and competence development is very timely and important. Many companies have started to embed sustainability targets into their business lines, which brings new people, of course, in touch with sustainability. And therefore, discussions on how to develop and analyze relevant competencies is therefore not a nice to, but definitely a necessity in these times. Therefore, I'm very happy that we today have with us two very, very experienced competencies with us to discuss this. I would like to introduce you, first of all, to Hans Reus, who is with us from Amsterdam. Hans is a managing director at the leadership advisory firm called Russell Reynolds Associates. And here, Hans helps clients align business practices with sustainability development goals. And also he partners with multinational organizations to identify, assess, and retain their top-tier executive and non-executive leadership talent. So good morning and a very warm welcome to you, Hans. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Mette. Much appreciated. It's an honor to be on this webinar.
Lovely, thank you. And next to us, we'll also have, of course, our very own Andreas Rasche, who's a professor here at CBS. He's a professor of business and society at the CBS Center for Sustainability. And also Andreas teaches a lot of our executive courses and some of our board leadership courses. And he is also the academic director of our new leadership program, Sustainable Leadership and Transformation. But let's jump right into it and say good morning, of course, to you as well, Andreas. It's a pleasure always to have you here.
Always a pleasure, Mette. Thank you for having me, and good morning to everybody on this webinar here.
Good morning. So before we start, I just want to say that during this session here, Andreas will take in questions and try to answer them as we go. So if you put them in the Q&A, if you have a question, we will pick up during the session in the timeline and as we go. So feel free to add questions in the Q&A, and we'll see how many we have time to pick up on. But other than that, I just want to say, please, if you have your phone very close to you, normally it's not a problem. It is pretty close to us normally. So in a minute, we'll do a little warm-up session with you with your phone. So please pick up your phones, because then we will have you engaged from the beginning. Yes. So are we ready, Hans and Andreas?
We are.
Perfect. Let's jump into it. Yes. So now I would like you to take your phone and scan the little QR code and answer the question on the screen. And let's see what comes in, just to get a feel for where you are on your sustainability journey out there.
Yes, and it would be really good if you answer this question, because that helps Hans and me also to understand, who is on this call this morning, and kind of, to contextualize our discussion, the questions and the answers. So this is usually of great help if we get this kind of information from you. Where are you on your sustainability journey? The proactive, active, reactive, or inactive?
I think I see a pattern here, which looks very nice. What do you find, Andreas?
Yes, I mean, from an academic perspective, I can say that the pattern is pretty clear. So we have kind of 2/3, 1/3 rule here, proactive and active. And of course, this is really good because the kind of discussion that we are having around competencies really kind of applies in this context. Hans, any reflections from your end before we go to the questions?
Yeah, no, this is super to see, and it's I would have expected this. People who spend the time on webinars or sustainability events like this typically are very passionate about the topic. They're willing to spend the time. Unfortunately, many of the other people that are not in this call, not in this webinar, would be skewed to the active, maybe reactive, in some cases even inactive. So the big question also for this webinar is how can we entice the other parts of society to be equally passionate about the topic of sustainability? And that's what I'm happy to contribute to today in your webinar.
Thank you very much. So then I would say let's move to the first question. And Hans, I thought it would be good to kind of start off the discussion with the kind of competencies that are needed, because we discuss this issue of competencies so often in ESG, sustainability competencies. I mean, these kind of phrases are all over the place. They are often discussed in social media. They are often discussed by companies. And so my question to you would be kind of what kind or which kind of competencies do you think do we need or do companies need to navigate this kind of continuously changing nexus between business and sustainability? So how do you see this? If you would need to explain it to someone, kind of what kind of competencies are needed? Where would you start?
So I hope you can see my slide now. The way we went about this is the following, and I'll answer your question in a minute, but let me just give you a little bit of background to the research we conducted a few years ago. Russell Reynolds is a global executive search firm. At the time, we produced something like 4,500 position specifications, and I had started analyzing how often any kind of sustainable leadership is part of the position specifications for senior leaders, executives, and non-executives that we place. And the result was very small at the time. It was less than 5%. And then the interesting part, a colleague of mine said, why don't you contact the United Nations Global Compact? Because they promote the Sustainable Development Goals. And that's also very much the context. When I talk about sustainability, it's the broad definition of sustainability, right? It's the environmental part, the social part, the governance part, the E, the S, and the G, the broad definition. And at the time, I managed to get a meeting with Lisa Kingo, who was at the time the CEO of United Nations Global Compact. And she said, wow, this is a fantastic topic. Why don't we define a research project and really try to understand what sustainable leadership is? So she pinpointed 50 leaders, including one or two in Denmark, by the way, CEOs of major companies who, in her eyes, were the front runners, the champions when it comes to sustainable leadership in business. And we interviewed those together with UN Global Compact, 50 leaders around the world across industries, and asked them, what made you a sustainable leader? What makes you different? Why did you become a sustainable leader, and so forth? So that was the backdrop for this piece. Can you see my screen, by the way?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So the report, Leadership for the Decade of Action, that's where this research is described. And what came out to answer your question is 5 competencies. And of course, if you need let's say a CEO for a bank, you still need to understand banking, right? So industry knowledge and functional knowledge aside, what makes the leadership special? The core of it all is what we would call, the sustainable mindset, the intrinsic, deep personal motivation to run a business both profitably. If you don't run a business in a profitable way, it will cease to exist at some point, but also in a sustainable way, not either or, but both and. That was their deep intrinsic motivation. They all had that. That was the core. The next one is what we call multi-level systems thinking. It's really seeing the big picture, long-term, multi-dimensions, sustainability and profitability, the strategic perspective, the geopolitical perspective, the technology trends, really seeing how it all hangs together. And not all CEOs are good at that, on the contrary. But that systems thinking is a big one. The next one is what we would call stakeholder inclusion. And many people talk about talking to NGOs and dealing with them and listening to them, but that's not enough. It is really partnering with all stakeholders. And a good example was, one CEO at the time said, during the pandemic, what many companies did is they started paying their suppliers later because it's good for the working capital of the company, right? If you pay your suppliers later. One of them, and it's described in the report that I just mentioned, said, well, no, let's approach this more strategically. Let's select the really important suppliers for us, and let's pay them sooner, earlier, because that will reinforce the partnership we have with them, that will enhance the probability that together we build an ecosystem that really is stronger than, excuse me, that is stronger than our competitors after the pandemic. So it's a strategic choice. It's not just charity or philanthropy. No, it's a strategic choice to build a better business. The third one was about innovation, disruptive innovation. That is product innovation, but it's also process innovation. So if you have a product, for instance, just an example, Fairphone is a manufacturer here in the Netherlands of really sustainable mobile phones. It's a modular design. If one component is no longer working, you can easily replace that yourself, not having to bring it anywhere else. But they also go as far as using raw materials that have been mined in a sustainable fashion. That creates a very different business model, a very different product design, a modular design, all of that. And this is just one example, but that's what we would call disruptive innovation. And these 50 leaders we interviewed were very good at that. And the last one, it's one thing to be the king of the mountain and be very sustainable yourself. But if you don't manage to embed that in the culture of the company so that everyone lives and breathes that sustainability culture, as well as the business angle to it, then it will fail the moment the CEO leaves. So embedding it in the culture, truly integrating it, is also something these leaders were very good at. So those 5 elements, I would say, describe a sustainable leader, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does, and I think it's a very, very good summary, I think, in terms of where companies or how companies and individuals also can think about competencies. Before I move on, just for the audience here, please ask questions. We have the Q&A open here. You don't need to hold back your questions. If you have a question, just ask it, and then I will try to integrate it here into the conversation with Hans. Before we move to the next question, Hans, let me maybe just ask a follow-up question regarding this mindset, because what I hear quite often is that people kind of say, well, that's nothing that you can influence. You're either born with this kind of intrinsic appreciation for sustainability or not. What do you think about this kind of attitude? Would you share this? I mean, is this something that we simply have or do not have?
We asked that question to the 50 leaders. And it's only a small sample, right? It's only 50 people. So the percentages I will mention need to be taken with a grain of salt. 45% indeed said, I was born a sustainable leader. One example, a CEO in the Far East said, when I was an 8-year-old, my parents invited homeless people every now and then to spend the night at our home. And then I was asked to sleep in the attic so the homeless person could sleep in my bed. If you're raised that way, then, or through religion or through other factors, some of those are indeed born sustainable leaders.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. So that was 45%. 43%, they said, no, I have become a sustainable leader over time. One of the CEOs here in the Netherlands said, I was a divisional head at the age of 32, and that felt to me like a moral obligation to run that business sustainably because I had such a big responsibility at such a young age. So I wanted to do something meaningful. Well, good for him. Okay. And then 12% had actually experienced something tragic, something dramatic, whether it was a kidnapping or a tsunami or the loss of a loved one. And they said, I'm just not going to bother about 0.25% EBITDA or 0.5% market share any longer because I couldn't care less. Now, the interesting part, and to answer your question, if you add that 43 and 12%, you end up at 55, which is just over the majority, which shows that, at least in theory, people can grow into a sustainable leader. You don't have to be born and raised a sustainable leader. You can develop yourself. You can become one.
Yeah, and that also aligns with insights from psychology, kind of that we can change even our kind of deepest held values. Let me go to because we're getting questions in here, and I think Anna Gerga asked an interesting one. How do you see these 5 competencies in the current world? Are they enough, or are other competencies needed as well? Because so much is happening these days. I mean, you mentioned it. You mentioned it yourself.
Clearly, this goes in peaks and valleys, right? I started with sustainability back in 2007. Then in 2008, the financial crisis hit in, and the whole topic just vanished. It disappeared. We started this research that I just described a year in advance of the pandemic. We didn't know that was coming, but when we interviewed these leaders, they all said the genie is out of the bottle. Despite the pandemic, sustainability is here to stay. The same thing as happened in 2008 with the financial crisis will not happen. Now, we've all seen what happened in the last couple of years, and especially the last year with the elections in the US and so forth, but also some populists in other countries. Clearly, there is pushback. Some big companies are pushing back. Some countries are putting regulation in place that pushes back on sustainability. But I think in the end, these sustainability topics, as described by the Sustainable Development Goals, are so important for the future of humanity and the planet as a whole. They will not disappear, but there will be peaks and valleys. Now, how do you entice a larger group, and especially the business community? That is not through what I would call green echo chambers, relatively small webinars or the sustainability events where idealists share their views. And frankly, I'm one of them, but it doesn't help entice a bigger group, especially for a business community like the community around the Copenhagen Business School. There needs to be a business case as well to involve and engage a larger audience. It's not either or, as we described in the sustainable mindset. It's not either or, it's both and. And if it's both and, I'm confident that we will be able to push this agenda forward, but it will take decades.
Yeah, thank you. Quite a lot of you ask questions around competence development. We get to that topic, so I will kind of also manage the questions in a way, just a little bit of feedback. Let's move to to another question I have around competence gaps, because I think there is quite a broad agreement out there that companies face competence gaps when it comes to sustainability. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, how do you think? I mean, you do also a lot of research on this at Russell Reynolds Associates. Do companies have such a gap at the executive management, but also for non-executive directors when it comes to sustainability? And how serious do you think is this gap?
So this is serious. And following up on the research I just described, which dates back from 2019, 2020, we did some follow-up research, which is called Divides and Dividends, addressing exactly the question you just asked. This was a quantitative piece of research. We surveyed over 3,800 leaders around the world across industries, as well as 8,700 employees who are not necessarily senior leaders, and we asked them a number of questions. This was around 2023 in 104 countries. And at the end of the presentation, I'll show where you can find this research. It's a very rich data set that people on this call may want to study. And indeed, as you indicated, there's a couple of major gaps. We call them divides. There were 4 in the report. Let me highlight 2 here. One is the leadership divide. 76% in our survey of the senior leaders say that their CEO, the CEO they report to, is personally committed to sustainability, which is a good thing. That's a high percentage. Having said that, only 50% of that group indicates that their CEO really drives the innovation that is needed to make the company more sustainable. Right? So there's a lot of talk, but there is not enough action. That's one divide we see. The other one is what I would call the mobilization divide. In other words, 63% of this large group of employees that we interviewed say they personally are very motivated to make the company they work at more sustainable. They want to feel proud of the company they work at. Having said that, only 10% report that they have frequent conversations with their direct line manager about sustainability. So there's this urge, this energy, this untapped potential that is not captured by the companies because the companies have different priorities.
Mm-hmm. So how do you think should companies go about this gap? I mean, if it seems to be a significant gap, particularly between the talk, and we know talk is always not cheap, but talk is easier than action, right? And commitments are of course easier than bottom line actions. How should companies think about this kind of competence gap, which you very clearly show here through this research?
So it starts at the top of the house in what I would call supervisory boards. And that from there, it trickles down to the rest of the organization. Obviously, there are also bottom-up initiatives, and I would definitely encourage the younger, not so experienced people in this webinar also to take their initiatives. But if it's not supported at the top, then it's an uphill battle. So what can boards do? And the main message is, and I teach at supervisory board programs at 2 universities here in the Netherlands, and the main discussion is always board members, supervisory board members should try and integrate sustainability as well as making money in everything they do, whether it's strategic planning, long-term business planning, acquisitions, annual plans, whether it's selection of people that can be externally or can be internal promotions, the whole succession planning. If you indicate that the company is very committed to sustainability, but you appoint a leader who clearly doesn't care, then that sets back the culture of the company a number of years, right? So succession planning, appointing the right people is super important. Obviously, the strategy should translate into targets. Targets for the top management, which then again, cascade down into the organization. The targets should be, linked to remuneration, an important topic. So if sustainability is an important part of the compensation package for senior leaders, then that might push some of the senior leaders into more sustainable behavior. If people are interested, there's a foundation called Reward Value, can be found on the web, and they've published a white paper on sustainable compensation. I was on the advisory board of that foundation. So those are just a couple of examples: strategy setting, reporting, succession planning, selecting people, remuneration. That's where it starts at the top of the house.
Can we maybe dig, because there were also a couple of questions on this, for instance, by Pia. Can we dig a little bit deeper on the rewarding side? Because that is a topic, that a lot of people are interested in, ESG rewards. And I mean, strictly speaking, if I look at companies, if I talk to companies, ESG rewards are actually there, and still we have the gap, right? Because so something does not seem to be right with the nature of the rewards, at least in some cases. I'm not saying it is a structural problem, but in some cases, of course, you have the rewards, they look good on paper, but in practice still it doesn't work. Where do you think do we need to kind of push or modify?
Yeah. And I'm not an expert in the field. There are other people who are more experts. So again, I'd refer to the white paper, but I can make a few points. One big thing is short-term versus long-term remuneration. Typically, an executive package consists of a base salary, a short-term variable, and a long-term variable part. The long-term part can be underweighted. For a private equity-backed company, it can be quite substantial, and that is at least a number of years out. But in other cases, it's mostly centered around short-term bonus. So that's not great. Second thing that was also in the press here last week, many boards are still struggling how to define sustainability, the double materiality analysis. Not all of them are equally good at it. CSRD will help, but CSRD is in flux, as you know. You published around that, Andreas. So They're still struggling with it. Here in the Netherlands, a piece of research showed that many executives are rewarded. They score higher on a relative scale on sustainability than on their financial targets, which can mean one of two things: either they do a fantastic job, or the targets are not, ambitious enough. I'll leave it at your discretion what's happening.
Yeah. No, and let me just say, I mean, this has been confirmed also by a study by London Business School and PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2022. They looked at the payout rates for carbon bonuses of executives, and they found that the payout rate was 86%. So in other words, to translate this, your carbon bonus was almost guaranteed, because, as you say, the ambition level was not high enough. I want to move our discussion to the development part, because I also see lots of questions around development here in the Q&A. And of course, I mean, now we know, which competencies matter. We know that there is a gap. What can executives and non-executives do to develop these kind of competencies that enable and support the sustainable transformation? So how should organizations think about this kind of competence development?
Great question. They can do a number of things. First of all is training and developing the people, which is why I'm passionate about this type of settings, and trying to help in this type of webinars. Educate and train the people on the skills they need. And I'd say there are two parts there. One is the technical sustainability knowledge, but it's probably equally, if not more important, is how do you entice the rest of the organization to become more sustainable as well? So that's much more in the area of change management, building coalitions of the willing. How do you specifically work with HR or with marketing or with finance to help advance the sustainability agenda? So that's the training and development part. The second is, of course, incentives, as we discussed already. If it's part of your compensation package, some people are very intrinsically motivated. Even if they were not compensated at all, they would still do the right thing. Some people don't care at all about sustainability, so even if you pay them twice as much, they wouldn't move. But there's a big group in the middle that might just be tilted a little bit towards the sustainability agenda if you incentivize them in the right way. Then there's, of course, the selection part, whether it's appointing external leaders or the internal succession planning that I referred to. I mean, some people just don't get it, and then maybe it's time for them to move on to another organization, or vice versa. If you feel that you're in an organization where there's no fertile ground for what you're trying to accomplish when it comes to sustainability, maybe you're not in the right place.
It's very interesting what you're saying, and I want to follow up with a question asked by Joost Baars, also from the Netherlands, about where to start actually, because you showed us these 5 competencies in the beginning, right? The mindset and then everything around. Are these developed in parallel, or is one of them a good starting point? I mean, how should we think about it in practice? If I were now, for instance, to develop the competencies in one organization where there's need for it.
So I think it starts with the belief that you really want to make a difference. I read the quote somewhere, committing to not leading a little life. I like that quote, committing to not leading a little life. If you feel I really want to make a bigger contribution, I want to leave a legacy by the time I retire, I want to be proud of what I've done when I'm talking to my siblings, to my kids, to my partner, it's that commitment. I really feel I should contribute more, and that comes in phases in your life. Then the next big question is, all right, now that I've made that commitment, okay, so what is it going to be? What kind of topic do I want to focus on? And I'd say the Sustainable Development Goals are like a candy store. Most people know about it, but if you think about your own personal career, go research them at the level of the 17 or at the level of the underlying 169 sub-targets. It's a candy store. If you had the choice, if you had the magic wand, which of those Sustainable Development Goals, in combination with a proper business case, would you really like to spend 60 hours a week on? So that's the second part. Then the third part is, once you figure that out, let's say climate action, or let's say energy transformation, or equal opportunities, whatever whatever makes you tick, then it's very nice to be contacting leaders in your country or at a European or even a global level, depending on your level of ambition, and say, I've really thought about this. I'm truly passionate about this topic. Dear Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, I see you're passionate about this topic as well. Can we please have a conversation about this topic? And because they are so passionate about it and you are, 8 out of 10, you'll find a very willing ear to have a conversation around that topic, which I obviously recommend to people who are thinking about a career switch. Because it's one thing to send your CV and say, I'm John, and I'm looking for a new job, and you get, if at all, a nice letter back saying we'll call you when we have something. But if you manage to get a conversation with someone high up, in society, in an influential position, who is equally passionate about the topic as you are, then you'll get a meeting, and he or she may defer you to someone else, and then you start creating your own options. So it starts with the commitment not to lead a little life. Then it starts, the next phase is trying to figure out what topic you'd like to focus on. SDGs, you can also look at your charity donations, which articles you'd like to read, but really figuring out what the topic is you'd like to spend the next 10 years of your career on. And then the final phase is start calling people that matter in the topic, that are really the movers and shakers in the topic that you're interested about. And you start creating your own options.
Yeah, it's great that you mention it, because this is also something that I tell my students all the time. I say, don't think about sustainability, right? Because it's, at the end of the day, it's about topics. It's about climate, biodiversity, water, human rights, anti-corruption. Think about topics that you're passionate about, and then this is what drives you, right? And I think this is really superb advice. You are working for an executive search firm, and let us maybe turn to the last topic here. And there were also a number of questions on this. How can executives and also non-executives select sustainable leaders? How do you do this? How do you identify someone with this kind of mindset? And this is not my field at all, but I imagine an interview is not enough, right?
It's not. And let me go through that from two angles. One, the interviewer. So that if you're a leader and you're trying to select someone, we'll go through that perspective, but also from the perspective of the interviewee. So if you're personally applying for a role and you want to make sure that it's the right fit. So two perspectives. In 3 phases. One, what can you do to prepare? What can you do during the interviews? And what can you do afterwards? Right? Very basic framework. Let's start with the interviewer perspective. The first thing you do is, most people will have a position specification that describes the company and what needs to be done and what criteria the applicant or the new executive needs to meet to be eligible for the role. In all 3 of those paragraphs, it should be clear what the sustainability objectives are. So what does the company want to achieve? What needs to be done in the role? And what criteria, what experience, what capabilities does this individual need to bring to be even considered for the role? So that's the position specification. Then once you have that position specification clear, during the interview, it's about asking the right questions. And just a couple of basic examples. If you ask someone who's applying for a job, how do you define success in your role, in your current role? And if they only come back with EBITDA, market share, the usual financial KPIs, then that says something compared to someone who has a broader perspective and says all of those financial metrics in addition to some of the sustainability metrics. And there are other questions, and in the back of the presentation, I have an whole article that describes that type of questions in more detail. The third thing, after the interview, you can start asking references around the candidate. It's one thing what your impression is of the candidate, but it's very important to also ask referees what do you think about Andreas Rasche when it comes to sustainability, right? And
hopefully not.
And you could even apply certain psychometric tests that go into some of the competencies that I described earlier on in this webinar. And if you add those layers on top of one another, the interview impressions, the psychometrics, the references, you'll get a pretty robust picture. Okay, so that's from the interviewer perspective. From the interview perspective, the interviewee perspective, it's also important. I would encourage people to look at their own LinkedIn profile or CV if they have one, and really critically ask yourself, does that LinkedIn profile or CV convey the message that I want to get across to the corporate world when it comes to sustainability? Does it really reflect that personal passion, that intrinsic motivation we talked about earlier? You also want to get a feel for how genuine the company really is that you're applying to, or the organization, when it comes to sustainability. If you are 3 steps ahead on your sustainability journey, and that's why the very first Slido question in this webinar is relevant. If you're 3 steps ahead, you're in the proactive stage, as 2/3 in this group were, but the company is still in its infancy, in the reactive mode, then you may be too far ahead of the crowd, and you may feel very unhappy and unsuccessful very soon. So there needs to be a bit of a match. You can be slightly ahead of the curve, and the company may want you to be slightly ahead of the curve, but not too far, because then there will be tissue rejection. And then after the interview, of course, it's not always easy in the first interview to really cover all of this, because there are lots of other things to be covered as well. But you can ask for a follow-up conversation. You can say, I would really like to dig into this deeper. Can we? And then depending on the outcome, it may be a good match or not so good a match.
Yeah, it's really fantastic advice, Hans. Thank you, and also very, very practical, I think. And coming from a very senior person like you, I think it really makes a difference. Let me go through some of the questions. We have a lot of questions, and I'm sorry that we won't be able to answer all of them, but I will give you some of them, and maybe you can answer them briefly so that we can cover as many as we can. So there's one question. Do you think that one root cause of all of this, for instance, the competence gap, is in recruitment, HR? Are these departments, functions ready to attract and select people with the needed consequences?
I don't think it's the root cause. Many of them can make steps forward in the right direction, but so can the finance department and the marketing department, and it's throughout the culture of the company. Sustainability cannot be successful in splendid isolation. It really needs to percolate throughout the culture of the organization, and that starts at the top of the house.
Within an organization, you have different departments: finance, independent sustainability, comms, CEO. Where do you reckon are senior sustainability leaders most effective in terms of influencing strategy, impact, tangible outcomes when you look at these different functions? And also considering that sustainability increasingly spills into other functions. Finance, I think, is a very good example.
I think in whatever function you are, you can have a really big impact. If you're in finance, you can influence the reporting. If you're in strategy, clearly you can weave sustainability into the long-term business planning, and that goes for all functional areas. So it starts with this personal motivation, and then they need to start building a coalition of the willing, really team up and start with the people who want to make progress and take it step by step.
And I think it also depends probably quite a bit on what you want to push, right? Kind of which aspects of sustainability you want to push. If you want to, for instance, push reporting, quantitative reporting, then of course acting out of finance often is an advantage. There's a good question here from Renata. I can't believe we are still looking for ways for the executive to take actions. How can we speed up the transition collectively?
And I'd say if you really want to speed up, there needs to be a business case in addition to the sustainability push. That's when you'll get the resources, that's when you get the management attention. And as much as I would like to propel and accelerate sustainability just for the sake of sustainability, that will only go so far. There needs to be a business case behind it, which means that some sustainable companies can grow and can grow fast, and some others will, in the end, go bankrupt, belly up. I would recommend reading, and it's also in the in the back of the presentation, Kate Raworth's book, The Donut Economics. Staying within the planetary boundaries, but above the social, inner circle, if you will. You need to be in that donut.
Yeah. And just a remark, we will send out the slides, of course, and there you have links to all the materials that Hans has discussed here. There's an interesting question here also regarding, do you think that the competencies that we discussed need to differ based on whether you, for instance, a graduate in the executive talent pool or an executive, so depending on the knowledge, or is this rather generic advice that applies regardless of where you are in your career?
Great question. The research we did was mostly focusing on the top of the house, right? That's where we focus as a firm. If you're earlier in your career, you're likely to start in a functional area or in one particular product. I think the systems thinking may be slightly less dominant there because you're early in your career and you're only focusing on a smaller part of the whole thing. But the intrinsic motivation, the disruptive innovation, the stakeholder inclusion, all of that is still very relevant. But it starts with that, that huge personal drive, that burning passion to make a difference in combination with making money.
There's one question which is also near and dear to my heart, and I know we discussed this before. What should be the right leadership approach to the current status of the omnibus directive and the future of sustainability reporting, due diligence? There is a lot of uncertainty these days, right? And kind of with your experience about leadership competence development, what would be your advice to companies in terms of leadership development?
Omnibus, for those who are not familiar with it, is obviously the redefinition, the redefining of the whole Green Deal. What I see companies do from time to time is the marketing side of the company blows the trumpet of sustainability. All the products and all the practices are super, sustainable. And then the lobbyists, quietly in Brussels try to push back and say, can we please reduce the burden of the Green Deal, the reporting and all that. And I can see, I've spoken to a lot of executives who truly think it's a big administrative burden. So maybe some simplification was in order. Having said that, if companies are truly authentic about sustainability, it needs to be consistent and authentic throughout the company, the products, the marketing, but also the lobbying side, the regulation, because regulatory change will be required to advance systems change. We need systemic change as well, in addition to individual companies.
Thank you so much, Hans. And unfortunately, my time is up, and I know that Meta is very strict about time. First of all, I want to thank you dearly for being here this morning, Hans. I think it's been great to have this conversation with you. It is such an up-to-date topic. I think that I think we could go on, and we have a lot of questions here, which unfortunately we cannot all answer. But I would encourage you to reach out to me, and I assume it's also okay to reach out to you, Hans, via LinkedIn, or in my case, also the email is on the website of CBS, and I'm happy to help you to answer questions on this. So thank you very much, Hans, for this morning. And with this, I hand it over to Mette.
Thank you, Andreas, and also thank you both. And for all of your participants, I hope that you will leave the session this morning with more food for thought and hopefully a little bit more enlightened on this topic. I will also take the opportunity to tease, of course, for our next, which will not be a morning brief, but it will be an afternoon brief, where we stay within this sustainability agenda. And next time we will have a look at corporate sustainability is in crisis. What should companies do now? That will be June 18th. And with us for that session, we will have, of course, Andreas, but also we are very privileged to have George Kell, one of the founding directors of the United Nations Global Compact. So I'm looking very much forward to that as well. George is today a chairman of a sustainable asset management firm that integrates ESG factors with modern quantitative analysis and technology. And of course, he has a lot of knowledge on what to do now, hopefully. So if you want to know more, please join us for this session as well. We will, of course, together with the slides from today and the references that Hans mentioned, we will send you the link to our website where you can sign up for this session as well. And of course, if you are interested in developing your own competencies or perhaps your employees' competencies, we do have here at CBS Executive Fund developed with Andreas as the lead, of course, a fantastic 10 days leadership program called Sustainable Leadership and Transformation, which will start in in September. And so if you scan the code, and of course I will also send you the link, you can read much more about this super relevant and super cool program as well. But I hope I kept time. I think I did pretty much. I want to thank you both, Hans and Andreas, again, for taking your time to enlighten us all, and to all of the participants. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and hopefully see you next time again. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Hans.
Thanks, Andreas. Thanks, Mette. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Ja,